the Children of the American Revolution, George Washington birthday luncheon, and then I was driving home filling up the gas tank, and I got the invitation for this, and I had no idea how that happened, but thank you very much for making this possible. I'm absolutely delighted to be here today for the Tartan Day celebration and symposium, and as John mentioned, my area of study is Scotland and the American Revolution. I'm particularly interested in Scots loyalists in the American Revolution. It's a subject that is at the heart of my larger work on immigration from Scotland in the 1760s and the 1770s, so in the era of the American Revolution. I'm very fascinated by what motivated Scots to leave Scotland in this period, what they hoped to achieve as subjects of George III in North America at this time, how they confronted the imperial crisis of the 1760s, and what happened to them during the War for Independence. And I'm slowly but surely working on a book called The Fury of Immigration, Scotland, the American Revolution, and the Fate of Empire, which hopefully someday will be out from the University of Virginia Press. And beyond my work on Scottish immigration, I'm also particularly interested in Scottish legal history. I did a postdoctoral fellowship at the University of Virginia Law Library, where we were working with folks at the University of Edinburgh and the Faculty of Advocates Library and the Writers of the Signet Library at Edinburgh on a project focused on Scotland's Court of Session. There are something like on the order of 2 million pages of printed Scottish court records from the 18th century that are vastly underexploited and sitting in very tightly thick-bound volumes. I'm sorry Chris left, because I was going to lobby the Scottish government to help fund the digitization project, but if somebody has his number, please let me know. Before I really dive into the subject for today, I want to tell you a little bit about what I do in my day job, which is I'm a historian and senior producer at R2 Studios at the Roy Rosenzweig Center for Digital History at George Mason University. And at R2, we are on a mission to democratize history through podcasting. We make narrative history podcasts, 2 of which you see here, one called The Green Tunnel, which is about the history of the Appalachian Trail, and one particularly fitting for this building called Consolation Prize, which is about the early history of U.S. foreign diplomacy and the consuls who were on the front lines of shaping American influence throughout the world. We are in development of another podcast I'll tell you about in just a second. If anybody is unfamiliar about how to subscribe to podcasts, please see me later. I'll happily do that on your phone. If you would also like help leaving a 5-star review of those podcasts, that would also be much appreciated. And I mentioned this studio and my work there because we're actually developing it went blank. You got a preview of it and then everything went dark. Oh. We're actually developing a new series called Worlds Turns Upside Down, which is about the history of the American Revolution. It is a series that will help audiences explore how individuals lived through the revolution and the war, how they experienced it, how they confronted this crisis, and how they navigated a conflict that was really very much an imperial civil war. In the United States, it's often thought of as a war for independence that creates a new republic, but it's not how these individuals, by and large, saw it. They saw it as a civil war that destroyed a large part of British America. And so we will be bringing this podcast to you later this fall. The painting you see here is emblematic of how we want to try to expand your horizons. This is called The Death of Major Pearson, which took place at the Battle of Jersey in early 1781. Now, importantly, it's not New Jersey. This is the Isle of Jersey off the French coast, which was a critical pinch point for French and American shipping, and the British invaded in 1781 in an attempt to disrupt supply lines and complicate North America's war effort. So we'll be talking about North America, we'll be talking about the Caribbean, we'll be talking about Scotland for sure, and Great Britain as well as many other places. So just be on the lookout for that particular podcast in the coming months, and I'm happy to point you to places where you can subscribe to that in time. And of course, since I am the series creator, it will, by necessity feature many Scots because I'm the captain of this ship, and that's what we're going to do. So you will see a great deal of Tartan influence, I think, in this show. In fact, the subject of my talk today is Scotland and the American Revolution, and particularly the Loyalists. And in many ways, a book that my colleague Matthew Deschicks has written, he was at the United States Naval Academy, and he's written a book called The Fatal Land, which is about the Highland soldier in North America in the 18th century. In many ways, that title, The Fatal Land, begins to capture a lot of what I want to talk about today, which is begin to tackle the question of why some Scots, why a lot of Scots, in fact, remain loyal to the crown during the American Revolution, because it suggests, that title suggests, The Fatal Land suggests that if we are to understand what motivates that loyalty in the war for independence, we have to know something about Scotland, Scots, and their place within the British Empire itself in the 18th century. We've also have to contend with what seem to us to be historical contradictions. That 30 years before the Americans rebelled against George III, some Scots, and not an insignificant number of Englishmen, rebel against George II in the final Jacobite uprising. And then many of those same Jacobites later supported George III's authority in the colonies in the American War for Independence. So let's begin then about thinking about Scots and the empire. And as one historian has suggested, by the mid-18th century, Scots were entrenched in the machinery of empire. 5 decades after the union of Scotland and England we just talked about a minute ago, 5 decades after that union, Scots have unfettered access to England's overseas empire. And in many ways, they embrace it. They become part of the imperial establishment in ways that they could not before because they were not part of that union. So we'll see them show up as royal governors. You know, our buddy Lord Dunmore's back there. He didn't have such a great time in 1775. But Robert Dinwiddie here was governor of Virginia and a great influence on George Washington in the mid-18th century. And Lord William Campbell of South Carolina, who's a figure I've written about, is the last royal governor of South Carolina and a member of the prominent Campbell family. Aha. Military officers. The Scots are extremely prominent in the British Army and Navy in the 18th century after the Act of Union. Military officers like John Campbell IV, Earl of Loudoun. Loudoun was the commander-in-chief of British forces for a time in North America during the 7 Years' War. James Grant of Ballindollack fought in the 7 Years' War. You can see a plaque of the charge he makes in downtown Pittsburgh today. He goes on to become the governor of East Florida, and then once again as a major general in the British Army during the American Revolution. And then Simon Fraser of Lovat, his father, of course, was executed as a consequence of his involvement in the 1745 Jacobite Rising, but his son becomes part of the British military establishment after his own pardon and uses that to great advantage and is one of the leading military commanders in the early months of the American Revolution. Certainly, as Chris was talking about and as he alluded to in his talk, one of the great boons for Scots in the 18th century is their access to the tobacco colonies in Chesapeake and Maryland, but also the sugar colonies in the Caribbean like Jamaica and Barbados. Scots go to these places and make huge sums of money, and in many ways, well, not in many ways, it does enable them to fund, on behalf of their merchant houses and their families, great manors like the manor of William Cunningham, who you can see on Queen Street in Glasgow. There's a Virginia Street in Glasgow for a reason, and it's because of the intense mercantile connection between Scotland and the North American and Caribbean colonies in this period. So these Scots and their families, they were invested in the empire economically, they were invested in it socially for political advancement, they were an integral part of the Scottish government. The empire made it possible for them to advance their interests, whether it be in British politics, in the creation of wealth, or in other ways. So then, we've been talking about a diaspora. The diaspora has been going on from Scotland for a very long time. So let's talk a little bit about then the immigrants. Not the army commanders, not the royal governors, but regular folk who are leaving Scotland and embracing the colonies. This is a 1755 map by a man named John Mitchell, who was a Virginian. It's one of the most important maps in American history because it shows the extent of what the British believed were their empire in the 18th century. Now, on the one hand, Scots are immigrating to the colonies on a sort of temporary basis. And so there's a lot of ways that we can classify Scots immigrants. And I'll try to compartmentalize that for you here. So on the one hand, you have Scots who are immigrating to Virginia and Maryland to work in the tobacco trade, or into the Caribbean as well to work in the sugar colonies. These are, as one historian called them, sojourners in the sun. They're temporary migrants. They're going to work in company stores in these colonies. They're trying to make a little bit of money, and then they're going to go home, probably to work in the main offices of the merchant firms in Glasgow. On the other hand, though, we can talk about Scots who intend on settling on a permanent basis. Those who are leaving Scotland with no real intent to ever go home, although they do maintain their connections there. In some instances, these individuals are officers and soldiers who had been granted land as a consequence of their service in the 7 Years' War. And I didn't include it, and I should have, but there's a wonderful map of northern New York by a man named Southier, and it has all the land grants given to British soldiers in the aftermath of the 7 Years' War, all sort of along the Lake Champlain corridor. There's a lot of Scottish names on there. And the same is true with what is now Prince Edward Island. A lot of Scottish names show up on those land grants. And the idea is that eventually at some point they will move, or their families will move, and they will have that land for themselves in North America as a consequence of serving the king in North America in this period. The land grants are another ways in which Scots are invested in the empire and its success. But in other cases, though, we see Scots moving and immigrating as families and entire communities. This was the case in the 1730s and 1740s when economic turmoil, combined with disruptions in Scottish society, combined with disruptions as a consequence of the final Jacobite uprising, compelled a lot of Scots from the Highlands and the Western Islands to resettle in colonies like North Carolina and in New York. Now, you will find, very curiously, in both of those colonies, 2 Argyll patents, one in each colony, where entire communities have essentially vacated their place in Scotland and gone to North America. Now, critically, in ways that we've been talking about today with maintaining connections with the diaspora and trying to figure out how to maintain and improve on those connections, those Scots who go in the 1730s and 1740s, they maintain their connections with kith and kin back home in Scotland, writing letters, reporting on family matters, talking about cheap land that their friends and family in Scotland can get. These are critical ways that Scots build a transatlantic network, a transatlantic community that later acts as conduits for additional immigrants who come in the 1760s and 1770s. But cheap land in America is simply not, cheap land in America was a powerful motivator to immigrate, but it's not enough to explain why Scots are willing to risk a transatlantic voyage with their families, especially in such numbers beginning in the 1760s, and that's the period that I really study. We don't know really precisely how many Scots immigrated in the decade and a half before the War for Independence. Historians have tried to count this through various ways, and happy to talk about how that was done. But let's just say 30,000 people. Just play it safe. 30,000 people who immigrate in the decade before the American Revolution with the intent to stay. And while many of the Scots who settle in that earlier generation of immigration, those who come in the 1730s and 1740s, often sided with American rebels in the War for Independence. And this is probably in part because they had been there for 3 decades by the time the war broke out. They had become acclimated to American politics. They had become interested in how colonial thought differed from sort of British imperial thought. So they tend to side with the Americans. Hugh Mercer is a great example of this. Hugh Mercer immigrates literally escapes the Battle of Culloden in 1746, manages to get out of Scotland, settles in North America, and becomes good buddies with George Washington, and he's one of the commanding officers in the early years of the American Revolution. The Scots, though, who immigrate from the mid-1750s onwards, those army officers, those soldiers, those families, with some exception, often side with the crown. And so cheap American land only partially explains this. It only partially explains why loyalty of so many Scots during the 1770s, especially, as we said, coming on the heels of that Jacobite uprising only 30 years earlier. We have to look at what's happening in Scotland itself to help explain why these more recent generations of Scots are remaining loyal to George III. One of the favorite ways I like to explore this, as a person you probably already know, is the life of Flora MacDonald. And there is a new biography by my colleague Flora Fraser out about Flora MacDonald right now, and it's very, very good, so I encourage you to check that out. It's called Pretty Young Rebel. Flora MacDonald, her life helps us to better understand the Scottish immigrants' world in this period and their attachment to the empire. As we kind of alluded to with some of the talks before, since the mid-18th century, there's been a lot of fundamental change in Scotland. Since the mid-18th century as well, Flora MacDonald has been highly admired both in Scotland and in the American colonies, later the United States, particularly for the critical role she plays in the final days of the last Jacobite uprising, which is, of course, the last major rebellion the British face before the one that takes place in this country. In 1745, thousands of Scots, some Englishmen, rise in rebellion in an attempt to restore the House of Stuart on the throne. They want to depose George II. They get really close, as we heard earlier. They come within 100 miles of London before they begin a series of strategic retreats as the Jacobite effort begins to become more disorganized, and eventually that rebellion ends at Culloden in February of 1746. Of course, the rebellion is led, or the uprising is led by Charles Edward Stuart, better known as Prince Edward Charlie, or Bonnie Prince Charlie. He was the son of the would-be king in exile. But after the Jacobites defeat at Culloden in April of 1746, Prince Charlie and the Scots who are loyal to him begin a mad scramble to get him the hell out of Scotland, because they know if he's caught, it's not going to go well for him. So later that spring, Flora MacDonald comes into the picture. She's 24 years old at the time. She encounters the prince in his small Rintoon on the island of Benbecula, where she agrees to smuggle him to the Isle of Skye. And they do so by disguising the prince as an Irish maidservant named Betty Burke. MacDonald accompanies him over the water to the Isle of Skye. They part ways, and Bonnie Prince Charlie manages to get back to Europe safely. MacDonald was captured by British forces about 2 weeks later. She's imprisoned aboard a warship. She's interrogated, and she's eventually placed on house arrest in London for a time, but she's eventually pardoned in 1747. There's a wonderful collection of materials called The Lion and Mourning that was collected about the uprising by a Scottish minister, and you can see that manuscript digitized online, and Flora MacDonald appears in that quite prominently. And this painting itself is emblematic of the kind of fame that she enjoys as a consequence of her participation in that rebellion. This was painted about 1749 by the very famous artist Allan Ramsay. There were 3 or 4 other portraits painted around the same time, because there is this kind of, and we'll put it in a sort of cultural romantic notion that the Jacobites were this brave lot who bravely met their end at Culloden. The rebellion is completely over. It will never threaten Britain again, so it's okay to celebrate them. And this painting and others like it are kind of emblematic of that cultural effusion that we see take place after the final uprising. But Flora and people like her are dealing with a much more serious revolution in Scotland than even beyond the Jacobite rebellion, that I would argue. And it's one that would in time convince them to emigrate to the colonies in the 1760s and 1770s. As we know, and as we've been hearing from various chiefs and whatnot, MacDonald and her family live in a world in the 18th century that is very much organized by the clan and the clan family. The clan chief was the kind of clan's great father, and it's too simplistic to say that this is a kind of feudal relationship, but we'll go with that just to sort of help our understanding. And sort of at the most basic level, the idea is that the clan chief offers his clan protection, and in return there's either a form of military service or labor. And so it creates this reciprocal relationship between chief and clan that was integral to Scottish Highland society and island society from the medieval period on forward into the 18th century. But that social system and that hierarchy that is rooted in the clan, that is intimately tied to the land itself, is beginning to break down. Clan chiefs owned vast swaths of land in the islands and highlands. They rent out these large tracts of land to men called tacksmen. Flora MacDonald's husband, Alan, was one of these tacksmen. You can think of tacksmen as kind of essential to the management of the larger clan lands in the estate. They rent out portions of the land that they're assigned to smaller tenants. They collect that rent in the form of mainly agricultural products from those tenants, and then they route a portion of that back to the chief. They were essential to the part of the estate management. But as I mentioned earlier, this system that has existed for centuries is breaking down, and it's breaking down very quickly. As historians like Alan McInnes have written, over the course of, say, roughly since the 15th century, a combination of social and political and economic forces are eroding the bonds that hold clans together and transforming chiefs in particular. Chiefs from across the Highlands and Islands begin spending more time living in Edinburgh or in London, near the centers of political power, where they are enjoying expensive lifestyles more than they are spending time living amongst their people. And by doing so, they are, at least as people thought at the time, abandoning their traditional duties as the great father of the clan and the duties that they had over these extended families. Over time, they transform themselves into absentee landlords. They become more concerned with bolstering their incomes to pay ever-increasing debt loads. They raise rents, sometimes 30%, often more than their tenants can afford to pay. They're trying to subsidize these aristocratic lifestyles and service the debt needed to fund them. British policies in the aftermath of the Jacobite uprising don't help things. They are an attempt to kind of break the bonds that hold the clan together, as we heard again, to ensure that there is no final Jacobite rebellion. So they pass things like the Dress Act that prevents you from wearing your kilt and tartan, can't carry weapons. They dissolve the chief's traditional judicial powers, which allowed them to mediate disputes between clansmen, and reoriented all of those legal proceedings to Edinburgh and to London. So it's having a dramatic effect in this period. And as these chiefs are becoming more like landlords, tacksmen like Alan MacDonald, Flora's husband, no longer felt sure of their place in Scottish society. Chiefs began dealing directly with their tenants. They began squeezing out the middlemen like MacDonald's, dislodging them from the land, but at the same time, they're also raising rents more than the common tenant can afford. And so many Scots make the choice to begin to immigrate. And this letter is kind of illustrative of what's going on in the Isle of Skye in 1772, where Flora and her family lived. She's writing to John Mackenzie of Delbin, who is a prominent Edinburgh lawyer. He is a central, really understudied figure in the history of land management in the Highlands in the 18th century, because he just is connected to everybody. And as we know, the lawyers are some of the most important people because they got the receipts. She writes that the best of its inhabitants are making ready to follow their friends to America. She's talking about the fact that there are ships showing up in Portree. They are boarding Scots from the Isle of Skye and the other islands, and they are stripping the landscape of their best people. Not only the gentility, the gentry, but also the laborers. This is also a period, of course, when we begin to see some Highland landowners enclosing their estates, essentially breaking up communal farming, and experimenting with sheep husbandry, which resulted in the displacement of some people. It's important to note, though, that we're not talking about the Highland clearances of the 19th century. This is not a period in which there is mass displacement, and brutally so, by people like the Countess of Sutherland will do in the 19th century. In fact, the Countess of Sutherland is a child in this period, and her state trustees are doing everything they possibly can to try to convince people not to immigrate. And so you do see, in several instances, lairds and chiefs and their subordinates attempting to convince people not to leave. Now, it gets worse beyond this because there's a series of short-term financial and environmental catastrophes that further dislodge people. You may know that there was, in 1772, there was a major credit crisis. A lot of British banks failed. That caused a lot of problems. But there's also, as I said, environmental calamities. In the spring of 1771, for example, a brutally cold winter in the Highlands kills off herds of black cattle, which are one of the primary agricultural commodities. And as I said earlier, right, if you more often pay your rent in agricultural products, and that spring kills, so many herds, ruins crops. Scots who are already struggling to pay elevated rents already now have no agricultural produce, not only to eat, but also to pay the rent with. They call this the Black Spring because it was so terrible. So because of these developments, because the long-term transformation in clanship, because of these environmental problems and these economic problems, Scots began immigrating in thousands to North America in the 1760s and 1770s. So Scotland no longer works for people like Flora MacDonald and her family. And many other Scots come to the same conclusion. But the British Empire does. And Gaelic-speaking poets sort of captured in song the loss of traditional clan and community and the promise of the empire and the American colonies. I didn't give you the Gaelic translation because I was afraid I would try to speak it because I can't speak Gaelic, so you got the English translation. But this is called The Song to the Exiles by John MacCordrum in circa 1773. Major poet, he was the poet to Sir Alexander MacDonald of Slate. And this is one stanza. Go now, my lads, to a realm without want. Abandon the land whose rent's gone beyond you, for the realm of the milk, for the realm of the honey, for a realm where you'll buy all the land you desire, for a realm without poverty, right? And here in this stanza encapsulates a lot of what's going on. The rents are too high, you cannot afford it, get on those ships and leave. But it also plays into this idea that people like Benjamin Franklin and other American colonists who are encouraging immigration are playing up the idea of America as the best poor man's place in the world. America is a land of milk, it's a land of honey. There's land there that you can own yourself. You don't have to rent it from it anymore. You can be a property owner, you can be your own chief if you so please. So you can hear, right, the sort of sorrow in this poem. And for many Scots, it did feel like exile. They didn't necessarily want to leave, but they felt that they had no choice. They felt that their chiefs had abandoned them, that the land had abandoned them, and yet Britannia itself offers another option. They could go to a place, as I said, where they could eat and where they could be their own landlords if they so desired. They could, in fact, be their own lairds. Now, excuse me. Where did I go? So immigration was one means by which Scots used the empire to their advantage. If they could no longer find a stable arrangement, or if things were no longer tenable at home, she could, as she told a friend in this period, follow their friends to America to begin the world anew, right? Keeping in line with this poem. The oppression that she describes, that she experiences in Scotland, hardens her position and clarifies in her mind that her native land no longer served her interests or those of her family. And so those pathways we talked about earlier, that earlier migration in the 1730s and 1740s, becomes critical here because the McDonalds go to North Carolina and they have been in contact with people who have gone before. They know whether they should settle in Anson County, North Carolina. They know that they can get land for certain prices. They have a lot of information already before they board a ship in 1774 to go settle with friends and family in the nearby Anson County area. Now, of course, you think to yourself, at 1774, things are not going well between the colonists and the mother country. Why are they leaving at this point? And there are some letters that say, you know, things aren't so great right now, maybe hold off a bit and we'll see what happens. But by and large, and it's important to note that disputes aren't unknown to Scots who are immigrating. By and large, their enthusiasm for immigration tells us much about how few people expected these arguments over taxation and representation to erupt into warfare, to say nothing of an independence movement. And it's important to note, right, that the first 15 months of the War for Independence aren't a war for independence, they're a war for reconciliation. And so Scots, like the MacDonalds, are also immigrating at a time, too, and this is where it gets even more complicated. They're immigrating at a time, too, when Americans of English descent also look upon Scots with great suspicion. And this is one of my favorite prints from the period. This is called The Scotch Butchery, Boston, 1775. And so a lot of Anglo-descended colonists are being egged on by their English allies and arguing that the rift between Britain and America is a consequence of Scottish nefarious actions. So in their minds, people like the Earl of Bute, who is right here. The Earl of Bute was Prime Minister in 1762. He was a mentor to George III, argue that he is complicit in this. Let's see, Alexander Wedderburn, who is Solicitor General of England, who embarrasses Benjamin Franklin before the Privy Council in 1774. He's allegedly complicit in this. And of course, Chief Justice Lord Mansfield, who sits on the Court of King's Bench. They argue that Mansfield, Bute, other Scots are corrupting English liberty, and therefore they are at fault for the dispute between the colonies. And then, of course, as you see, here are the Highland soldiers coming to oppress the Americans, and here are the English soldiers saying, my God, we would never do such a thing. Look how genteel we are. Look at all those Scots and how they are savage. And so this is a wonderful sort of piece of propaganda that also is emblematic of some of the attitudes towards Scots in this period. But when war does come in April of 1775, and we're not too far away from the anniversary of the battles of Lexington and Concord, Flora MacDonald, who played an integral role in a rebellion and revolution 30 years earlier, and her husband Alan and the Scots that had come in that same period face a very difficult choice. What are they going to do? Are they going to remain loyal to George III and the Empire of Opportunity, or are they going to side with the rebels and reject both? And ultimately, for a lot of the reasons that we've talked about, Flora MacDonald, key figure in the Jacobite uprising, and her husband remained loyal to the crown, as did many of their fellow Scots who came in this generation of immigrants. Now, it's important to note that not all those immigrants of this period remained loyal to the crown. John Witherspoon, of course, is a very prominent example of somebody who did not. Witherspoon goes on to sign the Declaration of Independence. He was from Paisley, excuse me. But Flora MacDonald and others like her, they stay loyal in hopes of preserving that empire that enabled their immigration, that made it possible for them to remain subjects of the king in another of the king's dominion, because in their minds, the empire with America was better than with it not. They didn't want to have to pick up and move again to begin the world anew. They have got land in North Carolina that is theirs. They're not renting it from anybody. And so why not fight to defend it? This empire created for them possibilities that did not exist in Scotland, and they went to war to defend the legal and constitutional underpinnings of that empire at the heart of those possibilities. And another poem makes really great sense in this terms of why Scots, like them, remain loyal. In the four corners of the world, George has land and men, and his prelates in each place, to save men from iniquity, They have law and parliament maintaining right and justice for them. So they live in an empire of justice, they live in an empire of law and parliament, they live in a constitutional order that they're willing to defend and die for, even if some Americans believe that the empire no longer works for them in turn. Now, unfortunately, Flora and her family find themselves again on the wrong side of revolution. In February 1776, her husband Allen and other loyal Scots and British regulars were defeated by the American rebels at the Battle of Moores Creek Bridge in North Carolina. Allen was taken prisoner, leaving Flora to contend with the confiscation of her property by the revolutionary North Carolina state government. Property confiscation was a legal weapon that the revolutionary states used against loyalists who they considered traitors to the new United States of America. The new states took loyalist real estate and they sold it to help fund the war effort. And Flora spends the next several years in hardship. Allen is released from confinement in 1777. He's deployed to Nova Scotia, but he doesn't see Flora again until they're reunited in Nova Scotia in 1778. Flora sails home for Britain the following year and eventually makes her way back to Scotland, where she dies in 1790, having lost 2 of her sons in the King's service in the American War. Some of you may have seen her grave on the Isle of Skye at Kielmere Cemetery. She's buried beneath an impressive grave marker that stands, I think, as a testament both to her own fortitude and those of other Scots who immigrated to the colonies in this turbulent period, and as a testament to the fortitude of Scottish history. But I'm extremely pleased to say, and I should say I've not been back to Scotland since the pandemic, so this is the closest I've gotten in a while, so thank you for letting me be here. You don't have to go to Scotland to see a relic of Flora MacDonald and the war that she and Scots loyalists like her lost because of an imperial civil war. Just a few hours south of here in Brookneal, Virginia is Red Hill, which is the final home of Patrick Henry. Of course, Patrick Henry, leading revolutionary, first-generation Scottish American. His father and brother immigrated in the 1730s from Aberdeenshire. Henry, Stamp Act crisis, willing to governor of Virginia during the Revolution. They have, remarkably, her tea service. I first encountered this several years ago when I had the good fortune of being the Patrick Henry Fellow when I was working on my dissertation, and discovered that they have her tea service. This is one of the things that she sold when she fled North Carolina. There is a museum in North Carolina that houses her silverware and silver plate. How this ended up at Patrick Henry's Red Hill, nobody knows. But they've been able to determine its authenticity. And it is an elegant reminder that while victorious American rebels are embarking on a new experiment in self-government in the years after the war, for many loyalists, especially immigrant Scots, like Flora MacDonald, who had already lived through 2 revolutions in Scotland, the war didn't necessarily end for them right away. It lasted a lot longer than we would like to think. The war turns that empire and the possibilities that it had for them upside down. And so thank you very much. I'll stop there. I'm happy to take questions. And go see the tea service at Red Hill. Sir.
One thing that terribly confuses the casual reader. When Flora befriended Bonnie Prince Charlie, she did not do that because she and her husband Alan were Jacobites. They were still loyalists to the crown. She did it simply for humanitarian reasons. And that confuses people because when they got to North Carolina, suddenly they were loyalists. How did that happen? How did she befriend Prince Charlie, who was a Jacobite, and then join the loyalists in North Carolina? That totally confuses me.
Well, I would actually push back again and say that she was in fact a Jacobite herself, and wasn't purely for humanitarian reasons. I mean, her father and her eventually would-be father-in-law were assisting in this process. And so the islands itself, she's born on South Uist and eventually ends at the Isle of Skye, but it is in many ways a den of Jacobitism. And so I would disagree that it was purely for humanitarian reasons. I think there's a political motive and ideology there that is motivating her to participate in the prince's escape.
Any other questions? Jim, maybe you can tell our guests how they can get in touch with you since you're local, and I know you alluded to that earlier.
Yes, let me just go back to, you get to take a tour back through my presentation. I'm on, if you're a tweeter, or what's left of Twitter, you can find me at James P. Ambuske or jamespmbuske.com. I go by Jim, but for whatever reason I set it up by my formal name. So, and I'm at George Mason University at r2studios.org. So look me up there. I'd love to talk to you. Thank you very much.